Room 217 at the Stanley Hotel. If you know, you know. It's the most requested room at one of America's most haunted hotels, the place that inspired Stephen King's The Shining. But here's what most people don't know: the real story is stranger than the fiction. A maid was blown through the floor by a gas explosion in 1911. Stephen King had a nightmare there in 1974. And today, hundreds of guests report the same unexplainable experiences in that very room. Coincidence? The power of suggestion? Or something else entirely? Welcome back to the Dark Folio. I'm May, and tonight we're checking into the Stanley Hotel in Estes Park, Colorado, a place where the line between genuine mystery and manufactured mythology has become so blurred we may never untangle them again. We're going to separate fact from fiction, explore the real history behind the hauntings, and ask the question that keeps me up at night. Did The Shining create the Stanley's haunted reputation, or did Stephen King simply reveal something that had been there all along? Welcome to the Dark Folio, where we explore the shadows of folklore, the supernatural, and the strange stories that refuse to stay buried. I like to call it my creepy little coffee break. 15 to 20 minutes of folklore, ghosts, hauntings, cryptids, all the strange, bizarre, and all the things in between. So if you're new here, welcome to the journey. And if you're returning, well, you know what we do. We dig into the history. We separate fact from fiction when we can and embrace the mystery when we can't. If you love what we do here, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss an episode. We've covered everything from the Bell Witch to the Mothman, and trust me, we're just getting started. Now, let's step inside the Stanley Hotel. The story of the Stanley Hotel doesn't begin with ghosts. It begins with death, or rather the desperate attempt to outrun it. In 1903, a man named Freeland Oscar Stanley, F.O. to his friends, received news that would terrify anyone in that era. His tuberculosis had returned. At 54 years old, Stanley was already a successful inventor and co-founder of the Stanley Motor Carriage Company, maker of those iconic steam-powered automobiles. He had money, influence, connections, but none of that mattered when you were a lunger, as tuberculosis patients were called back then. Tuberculosis was called consumption, or the White Plague, throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. It killed 1 in 7 people in the United States and Europe during this time, and the only recommended treatment, well, it was fresh air, sunlight, and hope. So Stanley did what many desperate men of means did in 1903. He went west. On the advice of his doctors, he and his wife Flora traveled to Denver in March, and then they moved to Estes Park in June, seeking the thin, dry air of the Rocky Mountains. And here's where the story gets great. It worked. Over that summer in the Colorado high country, Stanley's health improved dramatically. The man who'd been given a death sentence was breathing freely again, hiking the mountain trails, marveling at the views of Long's Peak. He was so grateful and so impressed by the natural beauty surrounding him that he made a decision. He would return every summer, and more than that, he would build something magnificent. But F.O. Stanley had a problem. Estes Park in 1907 was rustic. It was rough. The accommodations were basic at best. The social scene practically non-existent. And this would not do for a man of his standing and tastes. So Stanley resolved to turn Estes Park into a proper resort town. Construction began on the hotel in 1907. Stanley purchased land through representatives of the 4th Earl of Dunraven, a peer who'd controversially acquired 15,000 acres of the valley decades earlier. When Stanley suggested naming his new hotel the Dunraven, 180 local residents signed a buckskin petition begging him to name it after himself instead, because I guess the Earl hadn't exactly endeared himself to the locals. And here's a little did you know. The Stanley Hotel was one of the first hotels in the country to be fully electrified. from the lighting to the kitchens. To supply power, Stanley led the construction of the Fall River Hydro Plant, which brought electricity to the entire town of Estes Park for the first time. The Stanley Hotel opened on June 22, 1909, with 88 rooms of colonial revival grandeur overlooking the valley. It had telephones in every guest room, running water, electricity, and a sophistication that seemed almost magical in the remote Colorado wilderness. Stanley even created a fleet of specially designed steam-powered mountain wagons to bring guests from the train depot in Lyons. This wasn't just a hotel. It was a health retreat designed specifically for people with pulmonary diseases. The building itself was oriented to maximize southern exposure and airflow. The expansive porches encouraged guests to take the curative mountain air. The architecture, the positioning, the very purpose of the place, it was all about breathing freely and about living when death had come knocking. Stanley operated the hotel almost as a hobby, once remarking that he spent more money than he made each summer. But that didn't matter. The hotel was his monument to gratitude, his way of sharing the place that had saved his life. And F.O. Stanley lived to be 91 years old, outliving his tuberculosis diagnosis by nearly 4 decades. He died of a heart attack in Newton, Massachusetts in 1940, 1 year after his beloved wife Flora. And if the stories are true, neither of them ever really left the Stanley Hotel. But before we talk about what may or may not haunt the Stanley Hotel, we need to talk about what definitely happened there. June 25th, 1911, just 2 years after the hotel opened, the Stanley had been built to run entirely on electricity, a marvel of modern engineering. But the power supply proved unreliable, so in June of 1911, the hotel installed an auxiliary gas lighting system. On June 24th, the pipes were filled with gas for the first time, and that night there was an explosion. Elizabeth Wilson, a chambermaid, entered room 217 with a lit candle, unaware that there was a gas leak. The explosion threw her from the room, and she survived with 2 broken ankles. She would eventually return to work at the hotel, continuing her duties for years after the incident. But here's where things get interesting for us paranormal enthusiasts. According to modern investigators and countless hotel guests, something has remained in room 217 ever since. Guests in room 217 have reported lights turning on and off by themselves, luggage unpacked and neatly arranged when they return to the room. Now, I don't know about you, but that's my kind of ghost. The sensation of someone tucking them into bed at night, unexplained cold spots, and the scent of perfume with no source. The most common theory? That Elizabeth Wilson never truly left, that she continues her duties as a housekeeper, tidying up, caring for guests, making sure everything is just right. It's a comforting narrative, isn't it? The helpful ghost, the eternal employee. But we should ask ourselves, is this story real? Or is it something we've collectively decided must be real because it fits so perfectly with what we want the Stanley Hotel to be? I'm not here to give you answers. I'm here to give you the facts and let you decide. And the facts are, there was a real explosion. Elizabeth Wilson was a real person who was really injured. And since then, hundreds of guests have reported unexplainable experiences in that room. Make of that what you will. For more than 6 decades after it opened, the Stanley Hotel was exactly what F.O. Stanley intended it to be, a beautiful resort hotel that operated only in the summer months. It was elegant, peaceful, unremarkable in all the ways a good hotel should be. The Stanley had history, certainly. It had character, but it didn't have a reputation for being haunted. That all changed on one night in the fall of 1974. Stephen King was living in Boulder, teaching at the University of Colorado, struggling to make ends meet. He and his wife Tabitha decided to take a short trip to Estes Park, about an hour north. Local recommendations pointed them toward the Stanley Hotel. They arrived just as the hotel was preparing to close for the winter season. Most guests had already checked out. By the time the Kings had dinner that evening, they found themselves nearly alone in the cavernous dining room, all the chairs stacked on tables except theirs, canned orchestral music echoing through the empty space. King has told this story multiple times over the years, and the details shift slightly in each retelling, the way memories do, shaped and reshaped by time and repetition. But the core remains consistent. He was given room 217. Yes, that room 217. And that night, something happened. In the most famous version of the story, King says he dreamed. He dreamed of his 3-year-old son Danny running through the hotel's empty corridors, looking back over his shoulder, eyes wide, screaming, being chased by a fire hose that had come to life. King woke up in a cold sweat. He lit a cigarette. He sat in a chair looking out at the Rockies, and by the time the cigarette was finished, he had the bones of The Shining firmly set in his mind. Now, whether King was deliberately placed in room 217, knowing the room's history, or whether it was pure coincidence, we'll probably never know for certain. But it's a detail that's almost too perfect, isn't it? The Shining was published in 1977 and became King's third major success after Carrie and Salem's Lot. The novel tells the story of Jack Torrance, an aspiring writer and recovering alcoholic who takes a job as the off-season caretaker of the Overlook Hotel, an isolated Colorado resort that closes for the winter. Jack brings his wife Wendy and young son Danny, who possesses psychic abilities King calls the Shining. As winter deepens and the snow traps them inside, the hotel's malevolent supernatural forces begin to take hold of Jack, driving him toward violence against his own family. It's worth noting that in the book's front matter, King tactfully wrote, "Some of the most beautiful resort hotels in the world are located in Colorado, but the hotel in these pages is based on none of them. The Overlook and the people associated with it exist wholly in the author's imagination." But we all knew. The Stanley Hotel had provided the bones, the isolated setting, the off-season emptiness, the long corridors, room 217, and most importantly, that particular brand of terror that comes from being trapped somewhere beautiful that's become malevolent. Now here's where things get really interesting. In 1980, Stanley Kubrick directed the film adaptation of The Shining. But Kubrick didn't film at the Stanley Hotel. People think he did. He didn't. Instead, he used the Timberline Lodge on Mount Hood in Oregon for the exterior established shots, while the interior scenes were filmed almost entirely at the Elstree Studios in England, where elaborate sets were constructed. King famously disliked Kubrick's version. He felt Kubrick had missed the heart of his story, particularly in the portrayal of Jack Torrance. In Kubrick's film, Jack Nicholson plays Torrance as seemingly unhinged from the very beginning, whereas in King's novel, Jack is a sympathetic character whose descent into madness is gradual and tragic. Now, if you've read the book and you've watched the movies, you may have your own opinion. The movie is good in its own right, but there is some argument that King, and he stated that he just wasn't real happy with what Kubrick had put out. So in 1997, King produced his own 3-part miniseries adaptation. And this time, he insisted it be filmed at the actual Stanley Hotel. The place that had inspired the story finally got to be the Overlook Hotel on screen. And here's my favorite detail of the whole tangled story. In King's original novel, the Overlook Hotel doesn't have a hedge maze. It has topiary animals, lions, buffalo, and other creatures sculpted from hedges that seem to move when you're not looking directly at them. It is a crucial element of the book's horror. Kubrick changed this to a hedge maze for his film, creating one of cinema's most iconic sequences as Jack chases Danny through the frozen labyrinth. And then in 2015, 35 years after Kubrick's film, And 18 years after King's miniseries, the Stanley Hotel built an actual hedge maze on its grounds, not as a tribute to King's original novel, but as an homage to Kubrick's film adaptation. Now, as a side note, I have been a Stephen King fan for years, going back way until probably like middle school, okay? So I have a huge Stephen King collection, and there is a lot of debate in the King fandom about which is better. Is Kubrick's film better? Is the mini series better? Most people tend to really enjoy the Kubrick film. They feel like, it's got all the suspense and the drama, and Jack Nicholson, made the movie. But, and I am probably going to get a lot of flack for this, I like the mini series. Okay, so don't come after me if you don't prefer the mini series, but I really think the mini series is what King had imagined when he wrote the book. So, anyway, that was my side note. But think about the fact that they built this hedge maze in homage to Kubrick's film adaptation. The hotel that inspired the book now features an element that was never in the book, added by a filmmaker whose adaptation the author publicly criticized at the location where the author finally got to film his preferred version of the story. That's a long way of coming around to make things meet in the middle. The Stanley Hotel has layers of fiction and reality written over each other so many times that we can't really separate them anymore. And honestly, isn't that kind of cool? After The Shining became part of our cultural consciousness, something shifted at the Stanley Hotel. The stories began to multiply. The encounters became more frequent, and the hotel itself leaned into its new identity. So let's open the ghost file and talk about who or what is said to still walk those halls. Flora Stanley, the phantom pianist. Perhaps the most beloved ghost is Flora Stanley herself, Freeland's wife and a talented pianist. Late at night, guests and staff report hearing the faint notes of piano drifting from the music room. When they investigate, the room is empty. The piano sits silent. Yet many swear they hear distinct melodies, not just random sounds, as if Flora is still playing for her guests even in death. Some say her presence feels gentle, maternal even, as if she's still watching over the Stanley she loved. Security cameras have never captured anyone at the keys when the music is heard, but that hasn't stopped people from reporting the phenomenon with a remarkable consistency. F.O. Stanley, the proud host. And of course, Freeland Oscar Stanley, F.O., still makes his rounds. His apparition has been spotted in the billiard room, dressed in his finest, as if he never stopped being the proud host of his grand hotel. Some say he appears with Flora, the two of them walking the halls they built together, never quite ready to say goodbye. And then there are the children. Guests and staff frequently report hearing the sounds of children giggling and running in the hallways, particularly on the fourth floor. The laughter echoes through the corridors, footsteps patter across the floorboards, but when you look, there's no one there. Some say these are the spirits of children who stayed at the hotel long ago, still playing their endless games. Others wonder if they are something else entirely. And then we circle back to room 217 and our diligent housekeeper, Elizabeth Wilson. Room 217 has become the most requested and allegedly most active room in the entire hotel. Visitors report their luggage mysteriously unpacked when they return from dinner, clothes neatly folded and put away, lights flickering on and off with no explanation. Some even claim to wake up tucked tightly under the covers, as if a diligent housekeeper stopped by in the middle of the night. One guest reported feeling a cold presence watching him sleep. Another said they felt someone sit on the edge of their bed, but when they opened their eyes, no one was there. Now, you know me, I'm going to play devil's advocate for a moment, because that's what we do here at the Dark Folio. We don't just accept the stories, we examine them, considering this timeline. For more than 60 years, the Stanley Hotel operated without any significant reputation for being haunted. It was a seasonal resort hotel, elegant, historic, but not particularly spooky. And then Stephen King spent one night there in 1974, wrote a novel that terrified millions of readers in 1977, and then Kubrick's film adaptation became a cultural phenomenon in 1980. And suddenly, the ghosts start showing up in force. Does that timing feel suspicious to you? It should. But, and here's the important part, that doesn't necessarily mean the experiences aren't real. Here's what we know about human perception and expectation. When we enter a place we believe to be haunted, our brains become hyper aware. That old building settling, potentially a ghost. That unexplained cold draft, paranormal activity. We're pattern seeking creatures, and we're exceptionally good at finding patterns even when they might not exist. The hotel began offering ghost tours. Paranormal investigation teams arrived. In 2006, the hotel appeared on the Sci-Fi Channel's Ghost Hunters, where investigators claimed to capture evidence of supernatural activity. They returned for multiple episodes. Ghost Adventurers, featuring the hotel as well, with investigators conducting overnight investigations. At what point does a place's haunted reputation become a self-fulfilling prophecy? When does the expectation of experiencing something paranormal actually create the experience? I don't know, and I'm not sure anyone does. But here's the other side of that coin. What if the Stanley Hotel always had something unusual about it? And Stephen King, with his particular sensitivity to atmosphere and narrative, was simply the first person to really tune into it. What if his one night there wasn't the cause of the hotel's haunted reputation, but rather the revelation of something that had been there all along, waiting for someone receptive enough to notice? What if both things are true? What if the hotel had some unexplainable quality that King sensed, and then his novel created a feedback loop that amplified whatever was already there? Those are the types of questions that keep me up at night, that keep my brain running. In May of 2025, yes, this year, the Stanley Hotel was sold to the Stanley Partnership for Art, Culture, and Education for $400 million. Yep, you heard that. I'll say it again. $400 million for what is now a 140-room historic hotel in Estes Park, Colorado. What does that tell us? That the Stanley Hotel isn't just a hotel anymore. It's a cultural landmark. It's a destination for horror fans, paranormal enthusiasts, Stephen King devotees, and anyone who wants to test their courage by sleeping in room 217. The hotel has become a curious hybrid, part historic retreat, part scary movie tourism attraction, part literary pilgrimage site. You can take a ghost tour. You can book a night spirit stay with late night access to restricted areas, or you can request room 217 specifically, though there's usually a long waiting list. The Stanley Film Festival ran from 2013 to 2016, showcasing independent horror cinema. The band Murder by Death has performed annual winter concerts there since 2014. The hotel's reputation has taken on a life of its own, growing and evolving with each retelling, each investigation, each guest who arrives hoping to experience something unexplainable. And here's something interesting to consider. The hotel's current ownership and management haven't shied away from the paranormal reputation. They've embraced it. Because whether or not the ghosts are real, the economic impact certainly is. The Stanley Hotel's haunted reputation has become inseparable from its identity and, frankly, from its value. Is this exploitation? Is it preservation? Is it smart business? How about all of the above? But before we get too serious about all of this, let me share one more piece of Stanley Hotel trivia that might make you smile. Remember that 1994 comedy Dumb and Dumber with Jim Carrey and Jeff Daniels? The one where the two lovable idiots drive a van shaped like a dog across the country? Well, that Danbury Resort in Aspen where they wind up? That's actually the Stanley Hotel. Lloyd and Harry, in all their ridiculous glory, stayed at the same hotel that inspired one of the most terrifying novels in American literature. The Stanley has been the setting for both our nightmares and our laughter, sometimes in the same decade. And maybe that's important to remember. These stories, these places, these experiences, they are what we make of them. The Stanley can be a place of genuine mystery, a testament to our fascination with the unknown, a beautiful piece of history, or just a really nice hotel where Jim Carrey once filmed a scene in a tuxedo covered in toilet paper. And maybe it's all of those things at once. The Stanley Hotel sits where it's always sat, on a hillside overlooking Estes Park, with views of Long's Peak and the Rocky Mountains stretching out into the distance. It's been there for over 115 years now, outlasting its founder, outlasting the 1911 explosion, outlasting decades of obscurity to become one of the most famous, allegedly haunted locations in America. It was built as a place of healing, where people with tuberculosis could breathe freely and maybe outrun death for a while longer. And then it was transformed into a place of horror, where the isolation and emptiness became a canvas for our darkest imaginings. And now it exists somewhere in between, a real place with real history that's been overlaid with so much fiction, so much expectation, so much cultural mythology that separating truth from story has become nearly impossible. Did Stephen King experience something genuinely supernatural during his stay in room 217? Or did he simply experience what every artist experiences? That particular alchemy, where place, timing, imagination, and need combine to create something that didn't exist before. Does Elizabeth Wilson still tidy up the rooms, a dedicated employee even in death? Or have we collectively decided that story must be true because it makes the hotel more interesting? Is F.O. Stanley still checking on his grand creation from beyond the grave? Or are the shadowy figures people see just the play of light in a 115-year-old building that settles and creaks in ways that feel somehow alive? I don't have answers. Nobody does, really. And maybe that's exactly how it should be. So here's what I want to know from you. Would you stay in room 217, knowing its history, both the real history of the 1911 explosion and the fictional horror of The Shining? Would you request that specific room? Or would you make absolutely certain you were placed anywhere else in the hotel? Think about that. And then why don't you head over to our Facebook page and let me know what you decided. And here's the bigger question, the one that's been lurking underneath this entire episode. Do you think The Shining created the Stanley Hotel's haunted reputation? Or did Stephen King's novel simply reveal to a larger audience something that had been there all along, waiting to be noticed? The Stanley Hotel's still there, still operating, recently sold for $400 million. You can visit it. You can stay in room 217 if you dare. You can walk the corridors that inspired one of horror's greatest stories. You can wander through that iconic and ironic hedge maze that honors a film adaptation that the author didn't even like. You can decide for yourself what's real and what's mythology, because in the end, that's all any of us can do. I'm May, and this has been the Dark Folio. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and remember, the best mysteries are the ones we never quite solve.